It was the beginning of Lisa's shift, a long-haul flight from New York to London, nothing she hadn't done 1,000 times, before the usual hum of passengers, getting comfortable finding their seats, and the familiar call of names for last-minute boarding. But something about this flight felt different. She couldn't explain it at first. The atmosphere was thick with impatience, the kind of nervous energy you get before a big trip. Only Lisa wasn't thinking about that. She was focused on the elderly couple boarding slowly at the back of the line. They seemed out of place, too slow, too fragile. And even though she didn't know why yet, Lisa immediately resented them for it. When they finally stepped on the plane, the woman leaned heavily on the arm of the man, her small frame almost swallowed up by his large coat. He helped her with each step, as if she were a child needing assistance. She could hear their soft voices exchanging words that only they could understand. But it was the slowness of their movements that caught her attention, the way their steps seemed deliberate yet hesitant, as if every inch forward cost them something. She shook her head and forced a smile as they reached their row. Lisa had to step aside to let them pass her. As they awkwardly squeezed into their seats, she caught a glimpse of their faces, the man's wrinkles, deep as a canyon, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, as if they had been there for decades, and the woman's hair thin and silver, like the moonlight. Their clothes weren't much different from the rest of the passengers. But somehow everything about them seemed outdated, out of place. Lisa didn't know why, but she felt something she couldn't shake, a sense of discomfort that started in the pit of her stomach. Maybe it was just the way they looked at her, as if they were asking for something without saying a word. It was as though they needed help, but didn't know how to ask for it. And that irritated her more than she would ever admit to herself. She sighed inwardly and told herself it was just another day, just another flight full of passengers who didn't understand the pressure of the job. But even as she moved on to serve the others, a small part of her kept going back to them, the elderly couple in row 12, so out of place in a world that was moving far too fast for them to keep up with. Lisa refocused on the passengers around her, trying to avoid looking back at the couple, but every now and then she caught a glimpse of them, their hands clasped together, as if they were in some kind of silent communication, a bond that no one else could see. Yet Lisa didn't care. She had a job to do, she had rules to follow, and this wasn't her first time on a flight. It was her responsibility to keep everything running smoothly, even if it meant ignoring the soft voices of the elderly couple behind her. She moved from row to row, serving drinks, handing out snacks, all while avoiding eye contact with them. But as the plane reached cruising altitude and the cabin light dimmed, Lisa heard the soft voice of the woman calling to her from across the aisle. It was a faint whisper, but loud enough to reach her ears. "Excuse me, dear, could we have some water?" The request was simple enough, but it felt like a disruption, a small crack in the smooth routine of the flight. Lisa glanced at the couple as she moved past them, and for a moment she considered ignoring them. But she didn't want to cause any trouble. Instead, she gave them a half smile and kept walking toward the back of the cabin, hoping they would just wait like the others. She served the passengers in the rear quickly, as if her own irritation could fuel her efficiency. When she finally got back to the couple's row, she could feel their eyes on her. She walked past them, pretending not to notice their stares, but something about the way they were looking at her made her stomach twist, just slightly, a gentle but undeniable tug of guilt. But she quickly pushed it away, reminding herself that she didn't have time for anyone who couldn't keep up with the pace of the flight. Still, their eyes followed her, their silence louder than any words she could have imagined, and it gnawed at her. But she refused to acknowledge it, and instead moved on to the next row, knowing deep down that she had already made up her mind. She had no patience for the elderly couple or anyone else who didn't understand the pressure of her job. As the plane climbed higher and higher into the sky, the cabin lights dimmed, and the passengers settled into their routines. Some closed their eyes, others flipped through magazines. But Lisa couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her stomach. She glanced back toward the elderly couple in row 12. They hadn't moved. They were still sitting side by side, their hands locked tightly together, as if holding on to each other was the only thing keeping them grounded in a world that seemed to be speeding by faster than they could follow. Lisa tried to push the thoughts away and focus on her work, but it was hard to ignore the way their silence filled the space around her with a quiet tension. It wasn't just their age or their slowness that bothered her. It was the way they seemed so out of place, like two relics from a time that had long passed. She moved down the aisle, checking in on the passengers in her section, handing out drinks and snacks, keeping up with the demands of the flight, but still her mind kept drifting back to row 12 every now. And then she would glance toward them, only to find them still sitting there, staring ahead, not speaking, just quietly existing. Lisa shook her head and tried to dismiss the feeling, but it lingered like a shadow following her around the cabin every time she passed them. Their eyes seemed to track her every move, and something in their gaze made her uneasy. She didn't understand why they were so quiet, why they hadn't complained or made a fuss like some of the other passengers, who had already begun to get impatient with the long flight. The man was looking out the window, his wrinkled hands resting on his lap, and the woman was staring ahead, her eyes soft and distant, as though lost in some faraway thought. Maybe it was just their age, but it felt like there was something more to it, something deeper that Lisa couldn't quite put her finger on. And it bothered her. It wasn't until the fasten seatbelt sign blinked off and the plane reached cruising altitude that Lisa finally had a moment to herself. She slipped into the galley, taking a breath to calm her nerves. But even here she couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right, something was off. And it all seemed to center around row 12, she sighed, as she fiddled with a cup in her hands. Why was she letting this bother her? Why was she letting these two people who weren't even causing any trouble affect her so much? But even as she asked herself the question, she couldn't find an answer. She felt trapped between her duty to serve the passengers and her growing discomfort with the couple. Something about them was unsettling her, but she couldn't tell if it was them or if it was her own growing impatience. But still she tried to shake it off. She couldn't afford to focus on them. She had a flight to run and passengers to care for. But then the call came again. The soft voice of the elderly woman reached her ears as if she had been waiting for the exact moment. Lisa was vulnerable. "Excuse me, dear, could we please have some water?" The words were simple, but this time they struck a chord with Lisa in a way that she hadn't expected. She turned around slowly, her eyes scanning the couple as they sat quietly staring at her with those same gentle eyes, and something inside her twisted. A small pang of guilt tugged at her chest. She'd have been rude to them earlier. She had ignored them out of impatience, out of frustration, and now they were asking for something so small, so simple, and yet she couldn't even give it to them. Without hesitation, her pride fought against her, but something else was pulling her forward. The realization hit her like a wave. Their request wasn't a demand. They weren't asking for anything extravagant. They were just two old souls asking for water. But somehow it felt like more than that. It felt like they were asking for something she hadn't yet given them: respect, or kindness, or understanding. Lisa stood frozen for a moment. As the plane's engines hummed in the background, the noise of the cabin faded away. As she stared at the couple, what was it about them that made her so uneasy? Why did she feel so guilty for not helping them sooner? She couldn't answer. But she knew one thing was certain. She had made a mistake. She had judged them without knowing their story, without even trying to understand their need. Lisa's fingers twitched as she stood frozen in the galley. The hum of the plane and the muffled voices of passengers were distant, but the words of the elderly woman echoed in her mind. Could they really be asking for just a glass of water after everything she'd put them through so far? She could still see their eyes on her, in that quiet yet pleading way, like they were waiting for her to do the right thing. Something inside her stirred, but she wasn't ready to face it, not yet. She had worked hard to get where she was in her career. She didn't have time to worry about people like them, people who needed extra help, who slowed everything down. She had a job to do. And that was all that mattered, wasn't it yet? As she reached for the water bottle behind her, her thoughts betrayed her. She hesitated again. Why was this bothering her so much? Why couldn't she just move on and do her job like she always had? But the thought of their eyes followed her like a shadow that refused to leave her alone. With a sharp exhale, Lisa finally grabbed the cup and made her way back toward row 12. But this time she moved slowly, almost reluctant. She kept her eyes straight ahead, not daring to look at them until the last moment. When she reached their row, she saw the couple sitting there, still hands clasped together, their faces calm, unpatient, like they had all the time in the world. They weren't demanding, they weren't angry. They just sat there waiting, and something in Lisa's chest tightened for the first time. Since the flight had begun, she realized how much she had misjudged them, how much she had let her own frustration cloud her vision. She wasn't doing her job the way she was supposed. She was running away from what really mattered. And now here they were asking for something so simple, so easy, and she had treated them like an inconvenience. She knelt down in front of them, her hands shaking just slightly as she filled the cup with water. She looked at the elderly woman, first her eyes soft yet full of a kind of quiet strength, something that Lisa hadn't expected. She was looking at her with a calmness that made Lisa feel small and suddenly inadequate. The woman smiled at her, a smile that was gentle, but held a certain wisdom, as though she knew something Lisa didn't. The man beside her said nothing, but his eyes locked onto hers in a way that made Lisa feel exposed, like he could see right through her. And he probably could in that moment. Lisa felt a wave of shame wash over her, but she refused to let it show. She handed the water to the woman, who took it with both hands, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Lisa waited for a thank you, but the words never came. Instead, the woman looked at her and said softly, "Thank you for helping us." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Lisa's throat tightened as she stood there, feeling the weight of everything she had avoided in her life, avoided in this moment, avoided in these people. But what struck her most was that they weren't angry, they weren't upset with her, they hadn't yelled at her or complained. They had simply waited patiently for something she couldn't even bring herself to give them. Without hesitation, they had treated her with kindness. Even when she didn't deserve it, Lisa couldn't help but feel like she had learned something important, something that had been missing in her life, something that went beyond her job or the rules she was supposed to follow. But before she could say anything, the elderly man spoke. "It's never too late to change how we treat others." The words hit her like a punch in the gut. She had never expected a lesson to come from them. She had never expected them to teach her anything. But in that moment she realized that they had just done exactly that. They had shown her the kind of patience and kindness that she hadn't even known she was capable of giving, and it left her speechless for a long time. Lisa stood frozen in front of the elderly couple, her hand still hovering over the empty tray, as the man's words echoed in her mind. It's never too late to change how we treat others. She couldn't shake them. They clung to her like an invisible weight, pulling at her chest. For the first time, she began to realize that the irritation she'd felt earlier hadn't been about the couple at all. It had been about herself. She had judged them. Without knowing anything about them, she had acted out of impatience and pride, and the guilt she now felt was more overwhelming than anything else on this flight. She wasn't sure what had changed, but she couldn't deny it. There was something different inside her, something deep, that was shifting with every passing second. She couldn't look at them anymore. It was too much to face. She glanced down at the woman's hands clasped around the glass of water, and then at the man's quiet gaze. He was still watching her with that same calm, steady look, and it unnerved her how easily he could see right through her, like he knew exactly what was going on in her head. She opened her mouth to say something, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. They got stuck in her throat. She wasn't even sure how to start. How could she apologize for something so much bigger than just the glass of water? How could she explain that she had treated them like they were invisible, when they were the ones who had seen right through her all along? She turned away quickly, embarrassed by the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. But as she took a step back, something made her stop. She could still feel their eyes on her. They were soft, but firm somehow, and Lisa knew in that moment that she couldn't walk away from this without acknowledging what had just happened, without acknowledging what she had learned. She turned back to face them slowly this time, not with a forced smile or an attitude of distance, but with something real, something vulnerable. She stood there for a moment, unsure what to say, but then the elderly woman spoke, her voice gentle yet firm. "You're doing your best, dear." Lisa blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to process the words, "You're doing your best." Those were the words that the woman had chosen to say in a moment, when Lisa thought she was the one who had failed, when Lisa thought she had been the one in the wrong. And it stunned her. How could they be so kind after everything she had put them through, after ignoring their needs, treating them like an afterthought, when all they had wanted was a simple drink of water and a little respect? How could they still be offering her understanding instead of anger or resentment? Lisa felt a wave of emotion rise within her, and for a second she thought she might break down in front of them. But she fought it back instead. She managed to force out a quiet "thank you," barely above a whisper, and then she turned to walk away. But as she did, something in the back of her mind clicked, something she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the couple who had taught her something, it was herself too. It was as if she had been on autopilot before moving through life, doing her job without ever stopping to think about the people she was serving, the people she was dismissing. And in that moment she realized just how much she had been missing, how much she had been running from all this time. The world had moved on faster than she had realized. She had been rushing to keep up. But in doing so, she had forgotten how to slow down, how to connect with others, how to show empathy. And now here she was in front of the most unlikely teachers, two elderly strangers, who had reminded her of what it truly meant to be human, to show kindness, to look beyond the surface, and to recognize that everyone had a story to tell. But Lisa wasn't ready to walk away just yet. She wasn't ready to leave it all behind like she had done before. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes still on her. As she walked down the aisle, she tried to focus on her next task, trying to push the swirling thoughts from her mind. But it was impossible. The image of the elderly couple kept returning to her, the calm in their eyes, the quiet strength they had carried through the entire flight, as if they were holding a secret that Lisa couldn't quite understand. It gnawed at her, like a puzzle missing its final piece. She was shaken and unsettled, but she didn't know how to face it, how to face herself, and the quiet guilt that had been building up all day. She reached the back of the cabin, where a few passengers were chatting, but their voices seemed distant, somehow distant from her mind, distant from her heart. It was as if the air around her had thickened, and she couldn't breathe as easily. She turned away and walked toward the galley, needing space to think. But the pressure in her chest wouldn't go away. It felt like something was closing in on her, something urgent, and she couldn't tell if it was the weight of her own conscience or if it was the feeling that something bigger was happening, something that she couldn't fully grasp. She closed her eyes for a moment, leaning against the counter, trying to collect her thoughts. But nothing helped. The guilt from earlier was still there. It had been building since the moment she had dismissed the elderly couple in row 12 like they didn't matter, like they didn't deserve her time. And now their faces lingered in her mind. She could still see their hands clasped together, the way they had looked at her with such understanding, not demanding anything from her, but offering her a lesson she had never asked for. It was overwhelming, and Lisa couldn't escape it. She had tried to keep going, to ignore it, to focus on the flight and her duties. But every moment felt heavier than the last, and just when she thought she might lose herself in it, she heard a sound, the faintest cough. From behind her, she spun around to see the elderly man standing there in the galley. His presence was calm and quiet, but there was no mistaking the intent in his eyes. He was waiting for her. And for the first time since the flight began, Lisa felt her heart race, as if the air itself had changed. He wasn't angry, no, his face was gentle, But there was a purpose to his gaze, something unspoken, something that tugged at Lisa's heartstrings. His voice was soft but firm. "I know you're struggling," he said, and the words hit Lisa like a wave crashing into the shore. She hadn't expected him to speak to her. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge what had happened, or the way she had treated them. But here he was reaching out in a way that made her feel exposed, in the most vulnerable way possible. She opened her mouth to say something, to apologize, but the words were trapped in her throat. She had so many things to say, so many regrets, but all of them seemed pointless in the face of his quiet wisdom. She felt small in that moment, small and lost and uncertain of everything around her. The man continued, "You're not alone in this, you know." Lisa blinked, confused. She wasn't sure what he meant. She wasn't sure if he was talking about the flight or something deeper. But his eyes told her that it wasn't just about the flight at all. "We all have our burdens to carry," he said softly. "But we can still choose to be kind to others, even when we don't feel like it." Lisa swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she tried to process his words. How could he be so calm, so sure of himself, after everything she had done, everything she had felt, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her shoulders? But still there was no judgment from him, no anger, just understanding. She wanted to ask him so many questions, to tell him how much she had learned in the past few hours. But she didn't know where to begin. Instead, she just stood there staring at him as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out that same old faded photograph, the one he had shown her earlier, the one she had dismissed without thinking. And now she saw it again, clearly. The photo was of them both much younger, standing together in front of a small church, smiling at the camera. And suddenly the weight of it all hit Lisa in a way she hadn't expected. This wasn't just a couple of old passengers who needed some water. This was a lifetime of memories, a story that had been unfolding for decades, and she had been blind to it. But now everything felt so much clearer, and all she could do was stand there stunned. Lisa stood there frozen, staring at the faded photograph in the elderly man's hand. She couldn't look away. It was as if the photo held more than just a memory. It held the weight of a lifetime. The faces in the photograph were young, vibrant, full of life and laughter. It was hard to believe that these two people in front of her, who seemed so fragile, now had once been just like everyone else, full of hopes and dreams, like any young couple starting their journey together. But now they were here on this plane, stuck in time. It felt like a reminder of all the years that had passed, her own years flying by in a blur of routine and passengers, with no real connection to the people she served. The photograph in his hands seemed to ask her to see beyond the surface, beyond the roles they played in her life as passengers. And as a flight attendant, Lisa felt an unexpected wave of guilt rush through her again. She had seen them as nothing more than an inconvenience, nothing more than an elderly couple needing some water. But now, as she looked at their photograph, the weight of their history hit her with full force. They weren't just passengers. They were people who had lived a life together, shared experiences, laughed, cried, loved, and lost. And yet she had treated them as if they were invisible. She had looked past them, dismissed them in her rush to get through her shift. Her heart ached as she realized how much she had missed by not paying attention to them, by not truly seeing them. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to say something, anything, to make up for the way she had acted. But she didn't know how. She felt so exposed, so vulnerable, standing there with this elderly man who had quietly taken her lesson without her even knowing it. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to tell them how sorry she was, but something about the moment made it hard to find the right words. She just stood there silently as the man held out the photo toward her, a gesture that seemed to say so much more than the simple act of showing a picture. The woman in the photo was smiling with the man by her side, and Lisa could almost feel the love they had shared all those years ago. She could see it in the way they looked at each other, in the way their hands were intertwined. And for the first time, Lisa saw something more than just an elderly couple. She saw two souls who had been through everything together and had come out stronger for it. The elderly man gently placed the photo in Lisa's hand, his eyes soft and patient. "We don't ask for much," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But we do ask that people see us as we are, not as they want us to be." His words struck Lisa like a lightning bolt. She looked down at the photo in her hands, then back at the elderly man and his wife, who sat patiently in the gallery, not demanding anything, just waiting for their journey to continue. And in that moment, Lisa understood what he meant. It wasn't about the water. It wasn't about the service. It was about the respect, the dignity that every person deserved, no matter their age or their circumstances. It was about truly seeing them, recognizing their humanity beyond the simple roles they played in life, beyond their age, their appearance, their slowness. Lisa's heart began to soften as she realized the lesson they had taught her was so much deeper than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about being polite. It was about being present. It was about slowing down and truly seeing the people around her for who they were, not just who they appeared to be. She looked at them both standing there so calm, so composed, and suddenly it all clicked. They weren't just teaching her to do her job better. They were teaching her to be a better person, to be kind and patient, and to see the beauty in the moments that often passed by unnoticed. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She couldn't let them see her cry, not yet. She had to make it right. She had to show them that she had learned something she didn't know she needed to learn. Lisa felt the weight of everything shift inside her as the elderly man's words echoed in her mind. We don't ask for much, but we do ask that people see us as we are, not as they want us to be. She turned the photo over in her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the worn-out paper. It felt like a bridge between their past and present, between who they were then and who they were now. And for the first time she truly saw them, not as the old couple who had asked for a glass of water, but as two people who had lived a life full of meaning, full of stories that she would never fully understand, but that she could learn from if she allowed herself to listen. And in that moment, Lisa realized just how much she had been blind to. She had been rushing through life, so focused on her own ambitions and the demands of her job that she had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with others. She had been so caught up in serving without thinking about the people behind the requests that she had lost sight of the human element that was at the core of everything she did. The elderly man and his wife had shown her a different way. They had shown her that it wasn't about what was asked of her or what was expected. It was about how she responded to others, how she treated them when no one was watching, and how she respected their humanity, no matter what they needed, or how small the request might seem to her. Lisa looked up at the elderly man, who still stood before her, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no anger, no judgment in his gaze, only a calm patience, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling, as if he had been waiting for her to come to this realization all along. And as she looked into his eyes, something inside her broke open. She didn't know why, but she felt a flood of emotions rise to the surface, like a dam that had been holding back all the things she had been ignoring, all the things she had buried deep down. She thought she had been in control of her life, of her actions, but now she could see how much she had been avoiding, how much she had been running from, how much she had neglected the very thing that made life worth living, the connections with the people around her, the moments of shared humanity, the kindness that had been missing from her interactions for so long. She swallowed hard and opened her mouth, but no words came. She wanted to tell them how much he had changed her, how much his words had meant to her, how much she now understood, but somehow the words wouldn't come. Instead, all she could do was stand there holding the photograph like a fragile piece of their history. And in that moment, she knew she had to make a change. She couldn't go back to the way things were. She couldn't just continue pretending that everything was fine, when deep down she knew it wasn't. She had been looking for something meaningful in her work and in her life, but she had been looking in all the wrong places. She had been looking at the surface, not at the heart of it, all the heart of every interaction, every moment that she took for granted. But now she saw it clearly. Now she understood what mattered most. And it wasn't the speed with which she moved or the perfection of her service. It was the people. It was the way she made them feel. It was the connection she made with each person she met. And it wasn't just her job anymore, it was her life. This was a lesson that would stay with her long after the flight ended, long after she returned to the chaos of her everyday routine. It had already started changing her. And she knew it would continue to shape the way she saw the world from now on. But there was still one thing left. She turned to the elderly man and his wife and said quietly, "Thank you." The words felt small and inadequate, but they were all she could offer in that moment. And when the elderly woman smiled at her, her eyes twinkling with understanding, Lisa knew that it was enough. Lisa stood there holding the photograph in her hands, and the moment stretched on as if time itself had paused in the quiet of the galley. She could feel the weight of everything, the realization of what had just transpired, the understanding that had shifted deep within her. And yet, despite all the turmoil inside her, she felt a sense of peace, a kind of quiet certainty that she hadn't known in years. She looked at the elderly couple again and saw them not just as passengers, not just as a pair of strangers on her flight, but as teachers who had shown her something she could never have learned from a textbook or a training manual. They had shown her the value of connection, the importance of seeing people as they truly were, not as burdens or inconveniences, but as individuals with stories and lives that mattered. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized just how much she had taken for granted in her rush to get through life. She had been so caught up in the noise of the world, in the demands of her job, in the constant pressure to perform, but she had forgotten the simple power of a moment of kindness, a moment of understanding, a moment of genuine human connection. And yet here she was in this tiny cabin thousands of feet above the ground, learning the most important lesson of her life from two people who had no reason to teach her anything at all, but still they had given her so much more than she could ever have imagined. And as she stood there in front of them, she realized that she wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was something more. She was someone who could make a difference in the lives of the people she met. She was someone who could show kindness. Even when it wasn't easy, she was someone who could listen and truly see others. And that thought filled her with a sense of purpose that she had never known before. She wasn't sure how to thank them for what they had given her. But as she looked at their smiling faces, she knew that no words could ever express the gratitude she felt. So instead, she simply nodded and smiled back at them. And as she walked away from the galley, she felt lighter, somehow, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She still had a job to do, but now she approached it with a new sense of clarity, a new sense of purpose. The rest of the flight went by in a blur as she worked her way through the cabin, but now every interaction felt different. Every smile, every word of encouragement, every moment spent helping someone felt like an opportunity to make a small difference. She was no longer rushing through the motions. She was present, she was engaged, she was listening. And as the plane began its descent, and the passengers started preparing for landing, Lisa realized that she had been changed forever. The elderly couple had given her a gift she would carry with her for the rest of her life. And as the plane touched down, and the passengers began to disembark, she glanced over to row 12, where the elderly couple sat waiting patiently for their turn to leave the plane. And for a brief moment their eyes met again, and in that instant Lisa knew they understood, they knew what she had learned. And she knew that this moment would stay with her long after the flight was over. As the passengers left and the cabin emptied, Lisa felt something inside her shift even further. It wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about the way she treated others, the way she saw them, and the way she connected with them. She wasn't the same person who had stepped onto this plane hours ago, and she owed it all to the kindness and patience of two elderly strangers who had taught her more than she could ever express with words.